In the most recent episode of Disney Plus's The Santa Clauses, David Krumholtz made a big comeback as Bernard. The episode explained what Santa's former right-hand elf has been up to since the events of 2004's The Santa Claus 2. Krumholtz is now the star of Tom Stoppard's Leopoldstadt on Broadway. He talked about his return as Santa Claus, how Bernard's wig is always changing, and how he still enjoys his most famous role. Why did he go away to begin with? Starting us off, The Santa Clauses finally solves a major Bernard mystery. After Bernard the elf disappeared from the Santa Claus movies, the Santa Clauses finally told what happened to him. When Scott Calvin, Tim Allen, quits being Santa, the Santa Clauses gives him a whole new challenge. Unfortunately, his chosen successor, Simon Chasky, Kal Penn, makes a series of decisions that are well-intentioned but not well thought out. These decisions threaten to destroy the Christmas spirit around the world for good. In Episode 5 of The Santa Clauses, called Chapter 5 Across the Yuleverse, Bernard, Scott Calvin's most trusted elf from before he retired, shows up out of the blue. Since Bernard's last appearance in the series was in 2002's The Santa Claus 2, both Scott and audience are surprised by his return. The Santa Clauses tell Scott and the audience what Bernard has been doing since The Santa Claus 2. In The Santa Clauses Episode 5, when Bernard shows up, Scott says that the elf disappeared without a reason and never came back. Bernard says, "I met someone, a human." This means that he gave up being an elf on his own to become a married man. This tells us a lot about what it means to be an elf. Since Bernard left the North Pole to get married, it looks like elves can retire just like Scott did as Santa Claus. Bernard's sudden departure also seems to show what elves don't have to follow the same steps as Santa when they want to leave their jobs. Since there are so many elves at the North Pole, if one of them decides to leave, it doesn't throw everything out of whack. Why Bernard the elf has aged in The Santa Clauses. In the 5th episode of The Santa Clauses, Scott remarks that Bernard appears to be a great deal older than he was before he retired. According to Bernard, the reason he appears to be older is because I gave up eternal youth as an elf. In spite of the fact that Bernard has been alive for a total of 1,600 years, he claims that the act of getting married has caused him to mature and become more human. In spite of the fact that the elves in The Santa Clauses are quite elderly, Bernard stood out from the other elves because he had the appearance of a teenager, whereas the other elves had the appearance of children. This was due to the fact that actor David Krumholtz was only 15 or 16 years old when he made the first Santa Claus film, whereas he was 23 years old when he made the second Santa Claus film. The fact that Krumholtz appears to be 45 years old is explained in The Santa Clauses by the fact that Bernard got married and aged over the course of the film. In any event, fans of the Santa Claus movies will likely be pleased to learn that the wisecracking elf Bernard will be appearing in The Santa Clauses. David Krumholtz on Bernard's return to The Santa Clauses. David Krumholtz is best known for playing Bernard, the head elf in the Santa Claus trilogy. After 30 years, he's returned to the theater stage. He is in New York right now working on the smash hit Broadway play Leopoldstadt. He told KTLA5's Sam Rubin, "We're kicking butt over there. It's a pretty big deal. The actor hasn't performed on stage in 30 years. It hurts now that I have to do it again. The play is beautiful, so it's worth it," he said. "It's a really great and lovely play." Krumholtz also plays the head elf in The Santa Clauses, a Disney Plus show. This is the first time in 20 years that he's played this role. He didn't think the project would ever get done. The first two movies, especially the first one, have stood the test of time. They're still very popular and, in a strange way, getting more so, he said. "So I'm not surprised that Disney Plus decided to make the series. I've been watching it and it's really sweet and beautiful." He said that the show was different from the movie because it was a whole new chapter. It tells the story of the elves in a nutshell. It's a bit like the story of how Christmas came to be. Where did these little people live? Why do these elves exist? Why is there a magical being named Santa who can do all these magical things? The show finally answers these questions by mixing its own mythology and the myths that have been around for hundreds of years about Christmas and Santa Claus. The Christmas movie isn't the only one he's been in that still holds up. In the early 1990s, he was also in the movie Addams Family Values. Sam asked him if he had seen an episode of the new Netflix show Wednesday. "I haven't had a chance to yet. It looks amazing," he exclaimed. Well, The Santa Clauses Episode 5 just changed the entire franchise. With the reveals in its 5th episode, the Santa Claus movies are made. The Disney Plus miniseries The Santa Clauses starts with Tim Allen's character Scott Calvin delivering toys on what seems to be like a normal Christmas Eve, only to find that his power as Santa Claus is fading. This makes Scott decide that his time as Santa is over, so he hires Simon Chasky, a tech businessman played by Kal Penn, to take his place. But Scott's plan to stop being Santa doesn't work out out the way he hopes. In Chapter 5 Across the Yuleverse, the 5th episode of the Santa Claus's retired Santa Claus gets a surprise visit from his former elf Bernard, David Krumholtz, and an even more surprising visit from the Santa who fell off Scott's roof in the first place. Scott also finds out the truth about how he became Kris Kringle. The old Santa's fall was planned the whole time, and Scott Alvin has chosen to be the new Santa, not because his son Charlie Eric Lloyd told him to be. How the Disney Plus sequel show retconned the Santa Claus. In the Santa Clauses, when Bernard comes and brings Scott into the Yuleverse, he and the past Santa, who says he was the 17th Saint Nick, take Scott on a trip through the past like in A Christmas Carol. This includes a flashback of a young Scott Calvin, Liam Seja, meeting Santa on Christmas Eve. Santa is sure that the good-hearted Scott will make the world a better place, but he wipes Scott's memory of their meeting. After he meets his 16 predecessors as Santa, Scott finds out that one of them quit too soon because he thought he could no longer bring joy to the world after being on the job for too long. Instead, Scott's magic was weaker because less Christmas spirit was in the world, and Scott had to help bring it back. Unfortunately, the problem has gotten worse because Simon, in his role as Santa, has made some bad choices, like trying to make Christmas happen every day. That could wipe out the Christmas spirit around the world. Why, Scott was the first human Santa in the Santa Claus franchise. Santa and Bernard tell Scott that the good deeds of St. Nicholas of Myra, the first Santa Claus, led to the creation of magic and ethereal beings who spread the Christmas spirit that St. Nick started. They also show that each new Santa is chosen based on what people need at that time. In this case, the 17th Santa worked through the Great Depression and into the modern age, when technology was becoming a new kind of magic. This made Santa decide that the best person to take his place would be a human who knew about modern technology and other rules. Santa thought that Scott, as a human Santa, would be able to raise his family at the North Pole and teach his children magic. By doing this, the next Santas would no longer be a bunch of pompous ethereals. As the 17th Santa puts it, Charlie turning down the Santa Claus job takes Scott doubt that Cal, Austin Kane, and Sandra Elizabeth Allen Dick have magical powers, but Santa and Bernard assure Scott that they have. Bernard made the different Santa Clauses himself so that Scott would know what to do. Bernard also makes it clear that he was much more skeptical of Santa's plan from the start, that he thought Scott would fail as Santa. This makes it much easier to understand things like the Mrs. Claus and the Escape Clause. Instead of being made up on the spot, they were tests done by Bernard to see if a person like Scott could really carry Santa's magic. Scott has been spreading happiness as Santa Claus for decades, and Bernard praises him for overcoming his doubts and becoming the best Santa I ever saw. Unfortunately, guys, that is all the time we have for today. Are you as excited as we are for the return of Bernard? Comment down below. Also, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, cheers!